David Iliff with you, 21 to 8. Celebrated Australian journalist and documentary filmmaker John Pilger has died in London, as you would have heard in the last couple of days, at the age of 84. An incredible career as a reporter and filmmaker and, shall we say, thorn in the side of many governments, particularly Australia's. John Pilger was a strong critic of Western foreign policy and, of course, his native country of Australia, our treatment of Indigenous Australians. Chris Graham knew John Pilger pretty well. Chris is the publisher and editor of New Matilda. He's a Walkley Award-winning journo, a Walkley High Commendation winner, and 2 Human Rights Awards winner for his reporting. And they also worked alongside John Pilger on a documentary that came out back in 2008, I think it was, called Utopia, which is well worth a look at if you haven't seen it already. It's available on YouTube and should be must see, shall we say. Chris Graham joins me now. Chris, good morning.
Good morning, David.
Chris, thank you so much for your time. Firstly, tell me, how did you and John Pilger meet? Was it just in the lead up to making Utopia, or had you been mates and colleagues before that?
Well, no, 2013 was actually Utopia, but we met in 2009. He had won the Sydney Peace Prize, which was a pretty big deal. And in the course of the Sydney Peace Prize lecture, he gave me a pretty generous plug. And I was the editor of the National Indigenous Times at the time. And I didn't even know John Pilger. I knew who I was, but he was, the reason I got into journalism. I read him as a kid.
Wow.
And so I was pretty stunned and also very happy. So I wrote to him to thank him, and we kind of kicked off the relationship from there. And then about 4 years later, he asked me to work on Utopia.
It's interesting, though, your first exposure to him as a punter, as a reader.
Yeah.
And I think anyone who's in journalism has a similar story to tell in terms of a particular writer or a television journalist or whatever who steered them on that course unknowingly. What was it about John Pilger's work when you were younger that lit that fuse for you?
Well, I was really drawn to his war correspondence. I was also a big fan of Don McCullum, who was a war photographer around the same time. So I was really drawn to his war reporting, but also Secret Country. What I really liked about his work was it didn't fit the narrative that we all kind of grew up with. It was something very different. He always was butting up against authority, which I was too young to understand the importance of that at the time. But I think I instinctively knew, well, there must actually be 2 sides to a story, because this guy's telling a side I hadn't heard before.
But also, and this is based on, I sat down and watched Utopia yesterday afternoon and was just dumbfounded at the revelations. And, wished I'd watched it years earlier. But, that's just one example of his work from my perspective. But am I right? A lot of his work, it doesn't seem to be just, calling government to account for the sake of that or for the career advancement or for the ego trip of that, but for the right causes, very much a humanitarian sort of slant and bias to his work, would you say?
Yeah, I would agree with that. He was as much a journalist as he was an activist in many ways, but he happened to put journalism above activism. I think he just felt very passionately about issues, particularly Aboriginal Australia, but also Palestine. He was a very big, he believed very strongly in the issue of Palestine. He actually made a documentary in the early 70s called Palestine is Still the Issue. And then 20 years later, in 2002, he made another documentary also called Palestine is Still the Issue, making the point that nothing had really changed. And he had the same experience in Aboriginal affairs. In The Secret Country in the 80s, 84, it was exposing this horrendous neglect that Aboriginal people endured. And Utopia in 2013 did exactly the same thing. We actually went back to some of the places he visited to see if anything had changed, and of course it hadn't. So I think that's what drove his passion, was this burning sense of injustice.
Tell me, Utopia, because that is a film that you worked together on. You were associate producer. You just sort of outlined how that came about. What was that production like? I mean, did he go in knowing, like, with the intention of just revisiting some of these sites to see if progress had been made, or did he have a tip on one particular aspect of one of the stories that you and he uncovered in that documentary, and the rest just fell into place? Tell me about that process.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable description. He followed my work at the National Indigenous Times, and he was very, very moved by the Northern Territory intervention, which was a Howard government policy in 2007. He was very critical of the ABC's role in that, and that kind of drove him a bit. He was someone who was very critical of mainstream media generally, and so that experience, the Northern Territory intervention, and watching what happened, I think, kind of told the narrative of the whole film. It kind of summed up all the past injustice and the current injustice, and the fact that governments, in his view, in Australia, they're always putting band-aid solutions together to appear to fix the problems, or in the most cynical cases, we're launching policies that were designed purely to appeal to non-Aboriginal voters.
Yes.
So he was very... I mean, Utopia is... I think Utopia is an extraordinary film. I would say that, of course. But for me personally, I had been a journalist for 20 years by that stage, and when John asked me to work with him, it was the fulfilment of a childhood dream in a way. But I genuinely thought, after 20 years, brash 30-something-year-old, that there wouldn't be much I could learn about journalism, but this was still an amazing opportunity. But I learnt a lot about not just filmmaking, but journalism generally, which I should have known after 20 years, but I didn't. And that was, for me anyway, that was John's amazing impact on me, was that the way he did things, and the way he looked at things, and the way he prepared for interviews, and the way he did his journalism was so different to what I had grown up with and what I understood from working in the industry it was all about.
If you've just come in, by the way, it's 14 to 8. My name's David Iliff. Having a yarn this morning with Chris Graham. Chris is a publisher and editor of New Matilda. He's a Walkley Award-winning journo, and he worked with John Pilger back in 2013 is when the documentary came out, a documentary called Utopia, which is well worth a look. And we're talking about John Pilger, who died this week at the age of 84. Chris, you mentioned, and it's interesting there, after 30 years, I think you said, as a journalist, working with John on this documentary, you learned stuff that you felt perhaps you should have already known, or was still learning stuff. Can you just give me one example of that, just what you learned from the way he worked? And I suppose, leading to the question of what made him different to other journalists of his generation.
Well, look, I learned so much, but the thing that always stands out to me is how prepared he was for his interviews. I'd never seen any journalist go to so much trouble and work to prepare for an interview. And when you watch Utopia or any of his documentaries, it becomes pretty apparent, if you know the background, about how he ended up with such extraordinary interviews. The Warren Snowden interview, for example, in Utopia, is a pretty extraordinary interview. He's got a minister of the Crown sort of sputtering about what a stupid question he'd just been asked. And the question was, you've been in Parliament for 20-something years. Aboriginal people have always lived like this. Why haven't you fixed it? And Snowden's response was, what a stupid question, what a puerile question. That question we had workshopped for weeks prior to the interview, and we'd workshopped a lot of other stuff as well. But, and that was a 1-hour interview with Warren Snowden, which was condensed down to a few minutes in the film. But if you're sitting there live watching this interview unfold, it is extraordinary to watch someone with John's skill dissemble someone who has been trained how to deal with a very competent journalist. And Warren Snowden, in his defence, is a very competent minister and a very competent man. He's done more media than you and I probably done. But to be disassembled the way John did, it was incredible to watch. I mean,
I often wonder, though, watching that, And I guess this is because of how much time he spent overseas. And obviously the depth of his work in his career. He
Yeah,
came across as someone to be, I suppose, feared if you had something to hide, because you knew he'd done his research. But he also had a very, I noticed in that documentary, quite a gentle way of doing it. I mean, while
yeah.
his interview subject, the person he's interviewing, might have got riled up, John Pilger didn't tend to. He just asked very simple questions which got very much to the heart of the matter very quickly. So he could simplify anything for the average viewer, which I thought was outstanding.
Yeah, that's very true. I would describe John as occasionally thunderous. He could be very, very scary. But the real John, the John that people around him knew, was an incredibly kind and generous guy. The way I came to meet him was very John Pilger. He was trying to elevate another voice and share the limelight, and that's what he frequently did, was try to elevate other people and point the light towards them so that they got a bit of attention, and so that the issues they were trying to prosecute got up as well. He was very, very generous about that. And as you know, David, working in the industry, that's not how our industry necessarily works. It's
No.
a highly competitive industry, and people will slit throats to get where they got to get. John didn't do that. John was certainly uncompromising in the way he worked, but he was very, very generous with his time and his imprimatur. He would make sure that people who he believed were fighting the good fight were heard, which is, it's when you're that famous and that prominent a journalist, I think there's a risk you become the story. But John never wanted to be the story.
Chris Graham, you've been very generous with your time. Just a final question, if I may. Do you think that, is the death of John Pilger the end of the line of a particular type of journalist as he was, or are there others coming up like him? And I suppose in asking that, I guess I don't want to be critical of modern journalists themselves,
Sure.
but is it more the current climate that demands that journalists don't have the time to do the sort of in-depth work that a John Pilger did? But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, it's a $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, it's what people who love our industry sit and sweat and think about all day, every day. In all honesty, at the moment, I feel like it is the kind of end of an era, which is very sad. But there are journalists coming through and publications coming through that are trying to invest that time. You see them online now, not so much doing print, but predominantly doing YouTube and social media, and trying to replicate that kind of deeper journalism that John did. But I think the way he did it in that documentary style, we won't see much of that anymore, which I think is a huge shame. Hopefully there'll be a revival.
I very much appreciate your time this morning and your insights,
Thanks, David.
Chris Graham. A pleasure to have a chat to you.
Same. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Chris Graham there is publisher, editor of New Matilda, and worked and knew very well John Pilger. They worked together on the documentary, which came out in 2013. I was said 2008 before, but 2013, called Utopia. And, of course, reflecting on the life of John Pilger, who died in London this week at the age of 84. It's 7 to 8.